The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as Sarah Richardson stood at the sink, mechanically washing the breakfast dishes while listening to her daughter hum softly in the living room. Emma's innocent melody, a tune from her favorite children's show, was like a knife cutting through Sarah's heart. How could something so pure coexist with the darkness that had consumed their home? She gripped the ceramic plate tighter, watching the soapy water swirl down the drain, wishing she could wash away the memories just as easily. It was Tuesday, September 14th, 2023, and in exactly 5 hours, Sarah would sit in a Des Moines courthouse with her 3-year-old daughter, preparing Emma to testify against her own father. The weight of that reality felt suffocating. Sarah was 42 years old, a kindergarten teacher by profession, trained to nurture and protect children, yet she had failed to protect her own daughter from witnessing the unthinkable. The marriage had deteriorated gradually, like a photograph left in the sun, the colors fading imperceptibly until one day you realize the image is almost unrecognizable. James Richardson had always possessed a volatile temper, but Sarah had rationalized it, made excuses, convinced herself that it was manageable. He was a successful accountant, well respected in the community, charming in public. But behind closed doors, his anger festered like an infection. Over the years, his outbursts became more frequent, more intense. He'd punch walls, throw dishes, storm out of rooms, his voice rising to terrifying decibels. Sarah had learned to navigate his moods, to anticipate his triggers, to become smaller and quieter to avoid setting him off. It was exhausting, demoralizing, but she had convinced herself it was simply the price of marriage. Everything changed 3 weeks ago. It was a Thursday evening when James came home from work in one of his states. Something about a client meeting had gone wrong. Sarah didn't fully understand what, and honestly, it didn't matter. The reason was always different, but the outcome was always the same. Emma had been playing with her dolls in the living room, creating an elaborate narrative involving princesses and tea parties. Sarah had been preparing dinner, humming along to a radio station, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. When James walked in, he had immediately found something to criticize. The house wasn't clean enough, dinner was taking too long. Why was Sarah wasting time listening to that garbage music? Sarah had apologized, turned off the radio, rushed to tidy the scattered toys. She had performed the familiar dance of appeasement. But this time, James was in a darker mood than usual. He demanded to know why Sarah had been texting her friend Linda when he'd specifically told her to cut back on outside friendships. Sarah tried to explain that Linda was going through a divorce and needed support, but her words only enraged him further. He accused her of having an affair, of being a negligent mother, of embarrassing him in front of his colleagues. His voice grew louder and more vicious with each accusation. Emma, sensing the escalation, stopped playing with her dolls and watched with wide, frightened eyes. Sarah could see the fear in her daughter's expression, and it terrified her more than James's anger ever could. She had always tried to shield Emma from these episodes, but as James's rage intensified, it became impossible. He swept his arm across the kitchen counter, sending the ceramic pitcher Sarah's mother had given her as a wedding gift crashing to the floor. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, scattering across the tile. Emma flinched at the sound, her little body trembling. "No, please," Sarah begged, moving toward Emma to pull her away from the broken glass. "James, please, Emma is here. Please calm down." But her pleas only amplified his fury. He grabbed Sarah by the arm, his fingers digging into her skin so forcefully that she knew it would leave bruises. He shouted that she was a terrible mother, that she was poisoning Emma against him, that she was ruining his life. Emma began to cry, a high-pitched wail that tore at Sarah's soul. The little girl reached for her mother, screaming, "Mommy, Mommy," while James continued his tirade, seemingly oblivious to his daughter's distress. Or perhaps, Sarah thought with horror, he simply didn't care. It lasted only about 5 minutes, though it felt like an eternity. James eventually stormed out of the house, slamming the door so violently that a picture frame fell from the hallway shelf. Sarah immediately scooped up Emma, holding her trembling body close, whispering reassurances that she didn't entirely believe herself. "It's okay, baby. Mommy's here. You're safe. That wasn't your fault. Daddy had a bad day." Even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were lies. This wasn't okay. Emma wasn't safe, and it was completely unacceptable. That night, as Emma finally fell asleep after hours of inconsolable crying, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't live like this anymore, and more importantly, she couldn't allow Emma to grow up believing this was what love looked like. The next morning, she had called a domestic violence hotline and spoken to a counselor named Margaret who had guided her through her legal options. Margaret had been compassionate but direct. To protect Emma and ensure custody, Sarah would likely need to document Emma's trauma and potentially have her testify about what she had witnessed. The weeks that followed were a blur of attorney consultations, court filings, and protective orders. Sarah moved herself and Emma to her mother's house in Des Moines while the legal proceedings unfolded. The police report had been filed, photographs of Sarah's bruises were documented, and statements from neighbors who had heard the screaming were collected. But the most damaging evidence, her attorney Patricia Chen had explained, would be Emma's testimony. A 3-year-old's account of witnessing domestic violence would be powerful if Emma could articulate her experience, and if she could do it without completely falling apart in the courtroom. Now, as Sarah dried her hands on the kitchen towel and looked out the window at the September morning, she felt the weight of impending dread. She had prepared Emma as best she could, explaining in age-appropriate language that they were going to the big building, and that Emma might need to talk about the bad night when Daddy was very angry. But how could a child that young possibly understand the gravity of what she was about to do? How could Sarah expect her daughter to sit on a witness stand and describe the one night that had shattered their family? Emma walked into the kitchen, her curly blonde hair still tangled from sleep, her small hand clutching the stuffed rabbit she called Floppy. "Mommy, my tummy feels funny," Emma said, looking up at Sarah with those innocent eyes that had witnessed too much. Sarah knelt down and pulled her daughter into her arms. "I know, sweetheart. Remember what we talked about. We're going to see the nice judge lady today, and you're going to talk about that bad night." "Will Daddy be there?" Emma asked, her voice small and uncertain. "Yes, baby, but you'll be safe, I promise." As Sarah held her daughter close, she silently made a different promise to herself. Whatever it took, whatever she had to do, she would protect Emma and ensure that her daughter never again had to endure the terror of her father's rage. Today, in that courtroom, Emma's voice would matter. Emma's truth would matter, and Sarah would make sure the world heard it. She glanced at the clock on the kitchen wall. 9:47 a.m. In just over 2 hours, they would walk into the Des Moines courthouse, and their lives would change forever. The drive to the Des Moines courthouse took only 20 minutes from Sarah's mother's house, but it felt like driving toward the edge of a cliff. Emma sat in her car seat in the back, her small fingers absently twisting the ears of Floppy, her worn stuffed rabbit. The little girl hadn't spoken much since breakfast, and Sarah could see the tension in her daughter's tiny shoulders, the way her eyes darted nervously out the window as if she expected danger to jump out from behind every building. Sarah tried to maintain a calm demeanor for Emma's sake, but internally she was coming apart. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel. Her throat felt parched despite the water she'd drunk that morning. Every red light felt like the universe conspiring against her, prolonging this agony. She caught herself gripping the wheel too tightly and forced herself to relax, remembering what her therapist had said. "Your daughter will mirror your anxiety. You need to project confidence and safety." Confidence, safety, two things Sarah hadn't genuinely felt in months. "Mommy, are we almost there?" Emma's small voice broke through Sarah's spiraling thoughts. "Yes, baby, just a few more minutes," Sarah replied, forcing lightness into her voice. "Remember, we talked about this. We're going to see the nice judge lady in the big building." "Will the judge lady be nice?" Emma asked, doubt evident in her young voice. Sarah's heart clenched. How could she promise that? She didn't know if Judge Marion Whitmore was kind or stern, friendly or cold. She didn't know if Emma would be treated gently or harshly. All she knew was that her daughter's testimony could determine the outcome of their entire case, which meant Emma's emotional well-being was now entangled with custody arrangements, legal proceedings, and the possibility that James might still gain unsupervised visitation rights if the judge didn't find Emma's account credible enough. "She will be nice to you," Sarah said, choosing her words carefully, "because you're going to tell the truth, and telling the truth is always brave." Emma seemed to accept this answer, returning to worrying the rabbit's ears. Sarah turned onto the street that led to the courthouse, and her stomach dropped. The building loomed ahead, an imposing structure of brick and stone, with wide granite steps and tall columns. It looked intimidating to an adult. She could only imagine how terrifying it appeared to a 3-year-old. Sarah found a parking spot on the street and sat for a moment, gathering herself. She looked at Emma in the rearview mirror. Her daughter's face was pale, her expression unusually serious for a child who usually spent her days singing songs about dinosaurs and asking endless questions about everything. This wasn't how childhood was supposed to look. Emma should be worried about playground games and what snack to have after school, not about testifying against her own father in a custody dispute. "Okay, Pumpkin, let's go," Sarah said, unbuckling her seatbelt. As they climbed the courthouse steps, Sarah noticed people glancing at them, a woman and a tiny child holding hands, moving toward the entrance. Did they know why they were here? Could they sense the tragedy unfolding? Sarah's mother had wanted to come along for support, but Sarah had decided it was better for her to stay away. One supportive adult was all Emma could handle right now. Too many people would only add to the overwhelming sensory experience. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was cold and clinical. The marble floors echoed with footsteps, and the air seemed to carry the weight of countless sad stories. Sarah and Emma made their way to the family law courtroom on the second floor, passing other litigants, lawyers, and court staff. An older woman in the elevator smiled at Emma, and Emma shrank closer to Sarah, burying her face in her mother's leg. Patricia Chen, Sarah's attorney, was waiting for them outside the courtroom. She was a woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes and an air of competence that Sarah had come to appreciate over the past few weeks. Patricia had handled dozens of custody cases involving domestic violence, and she had been honest about the challenges. A 3-year-old witness is vulnerable to cross-examination. The other side will try to paint her as confused or coached. We need to ensure her testimony is as credible and authentic as possible. "How are you doing?" Patricia asked, placing a reassuring hand on Sarah's shoulder while bending down to Emma's eye level. "And how are you, Miss Emma? Are you ready to be a very brave girl today?" Emma didn't respond, just clutched floppy tighter. "We have about 15 minutes before we go in," Patricia said, straightening up. "Let me explain what's going to happen. Emma will sit in a special chair at the witness stand. The judge will ask her some questions, and she should answer as honestly as she can. Sarah, your ex-husband's attorney, will also ask questions. It's called cross-examination, and it might feel aggressive, but that's normal. We've prepared for this." They reviewed the key points once more. Emma was to describe the night of September 14th as accurately as she could. She was to tell the truth about what she saw and heard, without any embellishment. Patricia had emphasized that the most powerful testimony would be Emma's genuine fear and emotion, not a rehearsed script. "The judge needs to see that Emma is genuinely traumatized," Patricia had said during their preparation sessions. "Not exaggerating, not performing, but genuinely affected by what she witnessed." At 2:00 p.m., the courtroom doors opened, and Patricia guided Sarah and Emma inside. The space was larger than Sarah had expected: high ceilings, dark wood paneling, and an American flag in one corner. The judge's bench loomed imposingly at the front of the room. To one side sat James with his attorney, Robert Martinez, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit who had a reputation for being ruthless in custody disputes. James looked up as they entered, and Sarah saw something flicker across his face. Was it guilt? Anger. She couldn't tell. He had always been skilled at controlling his expression in public. Behind them in the gallery sat several other people, court staff, a stenographer, a bailiff, and a few observers who were apparently present for various matters. Sarah felt acutely aware of being watched, judged, evaluated. Emma was called to the stand. A court officer helped her up, and the little girl looked absurdly small as she was positioned in the witness chair. The bailiff approached with a Bible, and Sarah's heart sank as she realized they were about to swear in a 3-year-old to tell the truth. "Do you understand what it means to tell the truth?" the bailiff asked Emma. Emma nodded solemnly, though her eyes betrayed her confusion. Judge Marion Whitmore, a woman who appeared to be in her 60s with steel-gray hair and an expression of serious concentration, looked down from her bench at the tiny witness before her. For a moment, something shifted in her expression. Sarah thought she saw a flicker of sympathy, or perhaps concern. The judge seemed to recognize the gravity of what was about to happen. A child was about to describe trauma in a public courtroom, and there was no way to shield her completely from the experience. The prosecutor stood and began with gentle questions. "Emma, can you tell the judge about the night your daddy got very angry?" Emma's lip trembled. She looked toward Sarah, then at her father, then back at the judge. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the voice of a child to break the silence and change everything. Emma's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her eyes had grown wide and glassy, her small hands gripping the edges of the witness stand so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Sarah could see her daughter's chest rising and falling rapidly, shallow, panicked breathing that made her look like a trapped animal. The courtroom was silent, waiting for the 3-year-old to speak, but Emma seemed frozen, overwhelmed by the enormity of what was being asked of her. Judge Whitmore leaned forward slightly, her stern expression softening marginally as she observed the child's distress. "Ms. Richardson, perhaps we should take a brief recess," the judge said to the prosecutor. But before anyone could respond, something unexpected happened. The judge's eyes moved to the bailiff and she gestured with a subtle nod. The bailiff nodded back in understanding, as if responding to an unspoken signal. He turned and left the courtroom through a side door. Sarah felt confused. What was happening? Were they going to postpone? Would Emma have to come back another day, prolonging this nightmare? "We're going to pause for just a moment," Judge Whitmore announced to the courtroom. "I want to ensure that Miss Emma is as comfortable as possible while she provides her testimony. This is a difficult situation for a young child, and we want to accommodate her needs in whatever way we can." James's attorney, Robert Martinez, immediately stood up. "Your Honor, I must object to any accommodations that might prejudice the jury or influence the witness's testimony." He paused, glancing around the empty jury box. This was a bench trial decided by the judge alone. "Or rather," he continued, recovering quickly, "that might compromise the integrity of the proceedings." "Noted," Judge Whitmore said coolly. "However, I believe that using a comfort animal to help a traumatized child provide testimony is well within my purview as a judge. It's not about influencing her statement. It's about ensuring she can provide her statement at all. Without support, this child will be too traumatized to speak coherently. Proceed, bailiff." Sarah's heart leaped. A comfort animal. She hadn't even known that was an option. During her consultations with Patricia, they had discussed various strategies to help Emma feel safe, but a therapy dog had never been mentioned. Patricia turned to Sarah with a surprised expression that mirrored her own shock. The side door opened and the bailiff returned, but he wasn't alone. With him was a man in a police uniform, and beside him walked the most magnificent golden retriever Sarah had ever seen. The dog was large, probably 80 pounds, with a lustrous cream-colored coat that seemed to glow under the courtroom lights. He wore an official vest marked Victim Support Unit in bold letters. His demeanor was calm and purposeful, his dark eyes alert but gentle. Emma gasped. Her hands, which had been white-knuckled moments before, suddenly relaxed their grip on the witness stand. "Everyone," Judge Whitmore announced. "This is Officer Tom Bradley from the Des Moines Police Department's Victim Support Unit, and this is Officer Max. Officer Max is a specially trained therapy dog who has extensive experience working with child witnesses. Max has been certified by the International Association of Canine Partners and has successfully assisted in over 200 court proceedings. His presence is permitted under Iowa Code Section 915.3, which allows for support animals in certain legal proceedings involving vulnerable witnesses." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. She had no idea such accommodations even existed. The legal system was showing compassion. In her experience, courtrooms were cold, procedural places where emotion was viewed as a liability rather than an asset. Officer Tom Bradley was a man in his mid-40s with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor. He guided Officer Max slowly toward the witness stand, speaking to the dog in a calm, steady voice. "Easy, Max. We're here to help Emma. You know what to do, buddy." Officer Max walked with the bearing of a seasoned professional. His tail wagged once, slowly, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. When he reached the witness stand, he looked up at Emma with an expression of such understanding and compassion that Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Emma," Officer Tom said gently, "this is Officer Max. He's here to stay with you while you talk to the judge. He's a very good listener and he's very, very good at making people feel safe. Do you think Max can stay with you?" Emma nodded, her eyes never leaving the dog. Slowly, cautiously, she reached down from the witness chair. Officer Max, sensing her hesitation, took a small step closer, allowing the child to make contact with his fur. The moment Emma's small fingers touched Max's golden coat, something shifted in the courtroom. The tension that had been suffocating moments before seemed to ease slightly. Officer Tom positioned himself nearby but remained unobtrusive, allowing Emma and Max to form their connection without interference. The dog leaned gently against the witness stand, his presence grounding, his steadiness radiating calm. James's attorney made another objection, his voice sharp. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The presence of a dog could be construed as the court taking sides, as showing sympathy toward the plaintiff rather than maintaining neutrality." Judge Whitmore's voice became steel. "Counselor, I'm maintaining neutrality by ensuring that all parties can present their case fairly. If this child is too traumatized to speak, then we have no testimony at all, and justice cannot be served. The dog is not a jury member. It's not making a decision. It's simply helping a child access her own memory and voice. The testimony itself remains the evidence, and you will have the opportunity to cross-examine as vigorously as you see fit. The dog's presence does not change the substance of what the child says. It merely facilitates her ability to say it." Robert Martinez sat down, his jaw clenched. He understood that he had lost this battle. Emma's breathing had normalized. Her grip on Officer Max's fur was both gentle and desperate, as if the dog was her lifeline to safety in a terrifying sea. Max remained perfectly still, occasionally glancing up at her with those soulful brown eyes, occasionally tilting his head as if listening to her unspoken fears. Sarah watched this interaction, mesmerized. She had brought her daughter into this building to face the most difficult day of her young life, expecting Emma to navigate the experience alone. But somehow, against all odds, Emma had found an ally. The therapy dog seemed to understand exactly what the frightened child needed: presence without judgment, comfort without words, strength without intimidation. Patricia leaned over and whispered to Sarah, "The judge just played a brilliant card. That dog is going to change everything about this testimony. Emma will be able to speak now, and when she does, every word will carry the weight of her genuine emotion. The judge knows this is powerful evidence." Judge Whitmore settled back in her chair and looked at the prosecutor. "You may proceed, counsel." The prosecutor approached the witness stand cautiously, respectful of the new dynamic. "Emma, her hand still resting on Officer Max's head, looked up at the judge and the prosecutor with slightly more confidence than before. The dog's presence seemed to have translated her fear into purpose, her anxiety into determination. "Emma," the prosecutor began gently, "can you tell the judge about the night your daddy got very angry?" This time, with Officer Max's reassuring weight against her leg and his soft fur beneath her trembling fingers, Emma opened her mouth to speak. Her voice was small but steady, and the courtroom fell silent to listen to what this brave child had witnessed. Emma's voice was so quiet that the stenographer had to ask her to speak up. The prosecutor, mindful of the child's fragility, spoke in measured tones, asking questions that were carefully constructed to be age-appropriate, yet legally substantive. "Emma, on that night, the bad night, where were you when Daddy got angry?" Emma's fingers remained wound through Officer Max's fur, her small hand moving in repetitive, soothing motions. The dog remained perfectly still, his presence an anchor in the storm of the courtroom. "I was playing with my dolls," Emma said, her voice gaining slightly more volume. "I had Princess and Baby Doll and I was making them dance, but then Daddy came home and he was loud." "Loud how?" the prosecutor asked gently. "His voice was big and scary," Emma explained, her eyes distant as she recalled the memory. "He said mean things to Mommy. He said she was bad and stupid and didn't love him. Mommy kept saying, 'I'm sorry,' but Daddy didn't listen." Sarah felt hot tears sliding down her cheeks. This was her 3-year-old describing the most traumatic moment of her life, distilling months of accumulated fear and tension into simple, devastating words. "What happened next?" the prosecutor continued. "Daddy knocked something. It was loud and broke," Emma said, her voice trembling slightly. "I got scared. I wanted Mommy. Mommy came and grabbed me, but Daddy was still yelling and yelling. His face was all red and mean." "Did Daddy hurt Mommy?" the prosecutor asked. Emma nodded, and Officer Max seemed to sense the escalation of emotion. The dog pressed more firmly against the witness stand, offering his weight as comfort. "He grabbed her arm and twisted it," Emma said, demonstrating with her own small arm. "Mommy cried, I cried, I didn't like it, it was scary." Every word landed like a weight in the courtroom. Sarah glanced at the judge, who was writing notes, her expression unreadable. She looked at James, who sat rigidly in his chair, his lawyer's hand on his arm, keeping him restrained. The prosecutor continued with a few more questions, building the narrative of what Emma had witnessed, the broken pitcher, the shouting, the physical contact, the fear. Then the prosecutor said, "Thank you, Emma. You've been very brave. Now I'm going to sit down and another lawyer is going to ask you some questions. His name is Mr. Martinez. Just remember to tell the truth and Officer Max will be right here with you." As the prosecutor returned to his seat, Robert Martinez stood. He was a tall man with an expensive suit and an expression of cold calculation. He had built his reputation on aggressive cross-examinations, on finding inconsistencies in witnesses' statements, and using those inconsistencies to undermine credibility. Sarah's stomach tightened. Patricia had warned her that the cross-examination would be brutal. "Miss Emma," Martinez began, his voice taking on a tone that was simultaneously patronizing and menacing. "You're 3 years old, correct?" "Yes," Emma answered quietly. "And 3-year-olds sometimes have a hard time remembering things correctly, don't they?" Patricia started to stand, but the prosecutor put a hand on her arm, shaking his head slightly. They had prepared for this. "I remember," Emma said, her grip on Officer Max tightening. "Do you?" Martinez challenged. "Let me ask you this. When your father came home that night, had he been drinking?" I don't know," Emma stammered. "You don't know, but you said he was angry. How do you know he was angry at your mother and not just having a bad day?" "Because he yelled," Emma said, her voice becoming smaller with each question. "Children hear loud voices as angry sometimes when they're just normal conversations, don't they?" "No," Emma whispered, "it was mean." Martinez began packing, and Sarah could see the strategy. He was trying to plant doubt, to suggest that Emma's perception was skewed by a child's limited understanding of adult interactions. He asked her questions designed to trip her up. "Didn't you tell your grandmother the day after that you weren't sure if Daddy had hurt Mommy?" He hadn't. "Isn't it true that you often cry when you don't get your way?" Irrelevant, but designed to undermine her credibility. "How many times has your mother told you that story before today?" Attempting to suggest coaching. Emma's composure began to crack. Her answers became hesitant, uncertain. She looked toward her mother with desperate eyes. Sarah wanted to run to her daughter, to tell her it would be okay, but she remained frozen in her seat, understanding that any intervention would only weaken Emma's testimony further. Officer Max sensed the shift in Emma's emotional state. The dog rose slightly and leaned his full weight against the witness stand, his body language shifting to more active support. He looked up at Emma with an intensity that seemed to say, "I'm here. You're not alone." Martinez continued his assault of questions, his tone becoming increasingly aggressive. He suggested that Emma was confused, that she was influenced by her mother's bias against her father, that children often misremember or exaggerate frightening experiences. Each question was like a small blow, and Emma's resilience was visibly eroding. Then Martinez asked a question that seemed designed as a kill shot. "Isn't it possible that you're just repeating what your mother told you to say? That you don't actually remember that night at all?" Emma's lower lip began to quiver. Tears streamed down her face. The courtroom held its breath. This was the moment. Emma's credibility was on the line, and she was about to break under the pressure. But then something happened that no one anticipated. Emma didn't answer Martinez's question. Instead, she turned away from the attorney and looked down at Officer Max. She wrapped both her small arms around the dog's neck, burying her face in his golden fur. When she spoke, it wasn't to the prosecutor, the judge, or the defense attorney. It was directly to the dog, whispered so quietly that the stenographer had to lean forward to hear. "Max," Emma said, her voice breaking with genuine emotion. "Max, Daddy really did hurt Mommy. He really did. And it was scary, and I didn't like it, and it was real. I'm not making it up. Max, why do daddies do bad things? Why do people hurt people they love?" The courtroom erupted into a chaos of emotion that transcended legal proceedings. Sarah heard a gasp from the gallery. Patricia's hand flew to her mouth. The judge's pen stopped moving. Even Robert Martinez seemed to pause, recognizing that something authentic and devastating had just occurred. Officer Max turned his head and gently licked Emma's cheek, his eyes closing as if in acknowledgement of her pain. The dog didn't respond to her question with words. He couldn't. But his response was somehow more powerful than any answer a human could give. It was acceptance. It was understanding. It was unconditional presence in the face of profound hurt. Emma's unscripted words, spoken not to the court but to a therapy dog, had shattered the courtroom's carefully maintained procedural distance. This wasn't a child being cross-examined anymore. This was a 3-year-old girl expressing the core truth of her experience. She had witnessed something terrible. It had traumatized her, and no amount of aggressive questioning could change that fundamental reality. Robert Martinez slowly sat down. He had won nothing. In fact, he had inadvertently elicited the most damaging testimony of all, not because it was coached or rehearsed, but precisely because it wasn't. It was raw, unfiltered truth from the mouth of a traumatized child, delivered in a moment of genuine emotional breakthrough. Judge Whitmore set down her pen and removed her glasses, pressing her fingers to the bridge of her nose. When she looked up, her eyes were glistening. "We will take a 20-minute recess," she announced. "The witness is excused, but Officer Max, you may remain with Miss Emma in the witness room if the bailiff will accommodate that." As the courtroom began to clear, Officer Max remained with Emma, who clung to him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had become impossibly fragile and complex. Retrier, the witness room, was silent except for the sound of Emma's occasional sniffle and the soft rhythm of her breathing as she sat curled against Officer Max's warm body. The therapy dog's head rested gently on the child's lap, his brown eyes half closed in a display of serene compassion. Sarah sat beside them, her arm around Emma, unable to speak. What words could possibly address what had just happened in that courtroom? Her 3-year-old daughter had just articulated the central tragedy of their family's dissolution in a single, heartbreaking question. Why do daddies do bad things? Why do people hurt people they love? The bailiff had brought water and crackers as if such mundane offerings could somehow help. Patricia stood near the door, her phone pressed to her ear, speaking in urgent, hushed tones to someone on the other end. Sarah caught fragments. Most powerful testimony I've witnessed in 20 years. And the judge is clearly moved. And this changes everything. 20 minutes felt both eternal and instantaneous. Sarah watched Emma gradually relax, the dog's presence working like a sedative on her traumatized nervous system. She thought about how differently this might have gone without Officer Max. Emma would have been destroyed by Martinez's cross-examination. She would have crumbled under the pressure, contradicted herself, given him ammunition to paint her as an unreliable witness. But the dog had given her something courts could never officially provide, a reason to keep speaking truth. When the bailiff returned to escort them back to the courtroom, Sarah felt as though they were walking toward a threshold between two different worlds. Behind them lay the narrative of trauma and legal procedure. Ahead lay something she couldn't quite name, not yet. The courtroom had refilled during the recess. Sarah noticed there were more people in the gallery now than before. Had word spread about what happened? Did courthouse staff alert others to witness the resumed proceedings? The energy in the room felt different, charged with anticipation and unspoken emotion. Judge Whitmore sat at her bench, her expression grave and contemplative. She made a note in her file before looking up at Emma as the child was helped back into the witness chair. Officer Max resumed his position beside the stand, and Emma's hand immediately found his fur, gripping it like a lifeline. "Miss Emma," Judge Whitmore began, her voice notably softer than it had been before the recess, "I want you to know that you have been extremely brave. I also want to make clear to everyone in this courtroom that what you said during the break, those words you spoke to Officer Max, those words were heard by me, and I believe them. They were the most truthful thing I have heard today." James's attorney started to object, but the judge held up her hand. "I am not admitting those words as testimony in the formal sense, as they were not made under cross-examination. However, I am noting my observation that the witness demonstrated genuine emotional distress consistent with trauma exposure. That observation is relevant to my assessment of her credibility." The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, the plaintiff rests its case regarding witness testimony." "Very well," the judge said. "Mr. Martinez, do you wish to pose additional questions to the witness?" Robert Martinez stood, but his earlier aggressive demeanor had diminished noticeably. "No, Your Honor, no further questions." The judge nodded. "Miss Emma, you are excused. You have been very brave today, and I want you to know that what you told Officer Max about your feelings and what you witnessed, that matters very much. It matters to me, and it will help me make a fair decision." As they left the courtroom, Sarah felt something shift inside her. The testimony was over. Emma had survived. The truth had been told. But something else was beginning to unfold. Something that would eventually reach far beyond the walls of a Des Moines courthouse. Back in the courtroom, after Emma and Sarah had left, Judge Whitmore sat alone at the bench for a long moment, her hands folded before her. She was thinking about what she had witnessed, not just the facts of the case, though those were damaging enough. She was thinking about the profound moment when a 3-year-old girl had stopped speaking to the court and started speaking to a dog, and in that shift, had accessed a truth so fundamental that no legal argument could diminish it. The judge's law clerk, a young woman named Jessica who had been observing from the gallery, lingered in the courtroom after everyone else had left. She was visibly shaken, tears still wet on her cheeks. Jessica had interned at the courthouse for 3 years and had observed countless cases, but she had never witnessed anything like this. She had never seen a child break through the artificiality of courtroom procedure and simply speak from the devastation of lived experience. As Jessica walked to her office, she found herself thinking about what that moment meant. It wasn't just about this case. It was about something larger, about how the legal system approached child testimony, about compassion in the face of trauma, about the power of unconventional support systems. She thought about her own childhood, about how she had been terrified when her parents' divorce was being litigated, about how she had felt lost and unheard in the impersonal machinery of the legal system. That evening, Jessica sat at her computer, ostensibly working on filing documents from the day's proceedings. But instead, she found herself opening a personal social media account. She had no conscious intention to violate confidentiality. She wouldn't share names or identifying details. She simply felt compelled to express what she had witnessed, to capture the moment in words that might help others understand. She wrote, "Today, I witnessed something that changed my perspective on justice. A 3-year-old child testified in a domestic violence custody case. During cross-examination, she was being systematically torn apart by an aggressive attorney, but then something extraordinary happened. The judge had arranged for a therapy dog to support her. When the child broke down under questioning, she didn't cry to the court. She spoke to the dog. She asked the dog why people hurt people they love. In that moment, all the legal procedure fell away, and what remained was pure, devastating truth. The authenticity of a child's pain, the reality of trauma, speaking directly without filter. That moment changed everything." She posted it without adding location information, without naming the judge or attorneys, without any details that would violate the confidentiality of the proceedings. Just the essence of what had happened. A story about a child, a dog, and a moment of transcendent truthfulness. She hit post and closed her laptop, thinking nothing more of it. But within hours, the post had been shared hundreds of times. People responded with their own stories of childhood trauma, of legal proceedings that had failed to hear their voices, of the power of unconditional support. Within a day, the post had been shared tens of thousands of times. News outlets began searching for the story, trying to identify the case, the judge, the courthouse involved. By the next morning, the story had crossed from social media into mainstream news. Child's heartbreaking question to therapy dog stuns courtroom appeared as a trending topic. The narrative spread rapidly because it touched something universal: the fragility of children caught in adult conflicts, the power of compassion in institutions that often seem designed to eliminate it, the transformative impact of unconditional presence. Reporter stations began calling the Des Moines courthouse. The judge's office was flooded with inquiries. While Judge Whitmore initially tried to maintain confidentiality, the story had grown too large to contain. Within 48 hours, she gave a carefully worded statement to the press. "While I cannot discuss the specifics of any case due to confidentiality concerns, I can say that the use of trained therapy animals in vulnerable witness testimony has proven to be an invaluable tool for ensuring that children can access their own voices. The presence of such animals should be standard practice in family law proceedings involving child trauma." The statement only fueled further interest. National news networks picked up the story. Mental health professionals began citing the case as an example of innovative approaches to trauma-informed courtroom procedures. Advocates for domestic violence victims saw in the story a powerful statement about child protection. Videos of police dogs being trained for courtroom support began circulating. The hashtag #ListenToChildren trended nationwide. Emma's story, though her name remained confidential, had become a national conversation about how justice systems treated traumatized children. The innocent question she had asked a therapy dog had somehow transcended the specific details of one custody case and become a mirror for society to examine its own failures and possibilities. Sarah watched the news coverage from her mother's house, stunned and unsettled. Emma didn't fully understand why her words had resonated so widely. To her, she had simply been talking to a dog who made her feel safe. But to the nation watching and sharing and commenting, Emma had articulated something essential about the nature of truth, trauma, and the healing power of unconditional presence. The judge's decision was still pending, but something had already shifted. Emma's testimony, her unscripted moment of vulnerability with Officer Max, had already changed the conversation. And in changing the conversation, it was beginning to change the system itself. By the morning of September 16th, Emma's story had exploded across the internet with a force that seemed to defy the typical life cycle of viral content. Within 72 hours of Jessica's initial post, the hashtag #ListenToChildren had been used over 4.2 million times. News anchors on every major network were discussing the case. Ellen DeGeneres had tweeted about it. Celebrities were sharing the story. But more significantly, people from every walk of life were responding with their own testimonies, stories of childhood trauma, of feeling unheard in courtrooms, of the power of compassion in systems designed to be coldly procedural. Sarah sat in her mother's living room, watching her daughter play with blocks while television screens flickered with coverage of the Des Moines case, as it had come to be known in news cycles. The irony was not lost on her. Emma was playing innocently while her pain was being dissected and analyzed by millions of strangers. News vans had begun appearing outside the courthouse. Reporters were staking out locations, trying to identify the family involved. While the judge's confidentiality order had protected their names from official disclosure, the internet's collective investigative prowess was formidable. Patricia called Sarah on the morning of the 16th. "We need to talk about media strategy," the attorney said without preamble. "The story has grown far beyond the courtroom. I've had requests from 3 major networks for exclusive interviews. There are book offers coming in. I've also had calls from domestic violence advocacy organizations asking if you'd be willing to speak at events." Sarah felt overwhelmed. "I don't want to exploit Emma's trauma for publicity or profit," she said firmly. "I understand," Patricia replied. "But the flip side is that silence allows others to control the narrative. Right now, misinformation is spreading. Some outlets are claiming this is a made-up story, a hoax designed to push a particular agenda about family courts. Others are exaggerating details. By stepping forward carefully and thoughtfully, you can ensure that Emma's story is told with accuracy and dignity." Sarah still wasn't convinced, but she agreed to think about it. Meanwhile, the story had already spawned countless reactions and interpretations. A professor of family law at the University of Iowa published an op-ed titled "A 3-Year-Old's Truth: What Emma's Testimony Reveals About Our Broken Justice System." In it, she argued that while therapy animals were valuable, the real issue was that courts were failing children systematically. "This child had to break down into raw emotional trauma just to be believed," the professor wrote. "We should be asking ourselves, how many other children's truths are being dismissed or distorted because we require them to perform their pain according to legal rules designed for adults?" Domestic violence advocacy organizations mobilized around Emma's story. The National Coalition Against Domestic Violence released a statement. This case highlights the urgent need to reform how child witnesses are treated in family law proceedings. Children who witness domestic violence deserve support systems, trauma-informed approaches, and validation of their experiences. This is not about taking sides in custody disputes. It's about protecting children from further harm. A TikTok creator with 3.7 million followers posted a video about the case, and it was viewed 18 million times within 48 hours. In the comments section, thousands of people shared their own stories. A woman from Colorado wrote, "I testified in court when I was 7 years old about my father hitting my mother. The judge didn't believe me. The lawyers made me feel like I was lying. I spent my whole life feeling like my truth didn't matter. If a dog had been there, maybe I wouldn't have spent 30 years in therapy. A man from Texas shared, "My daughter witnessed violence in my home. I'm so ashamed. But reading about this child and how she finally felt safe enough to speak her truth, it's making me face what I did. I'm seeking help now." The Des Moines Police Department's Victim Support Unit was inundated with calls and emails. Officer Tom Bradley, Max's handler, gave several interviews about the training process and the efficacy of therapy animals in courtroom settings. He became something of a media figure, appearing on morning talk shows to discuss trauma-informed approaches to child testimony. Each appearance brought more visibility to the program and to the broader conversation about how justice systems should handle vulnerable witnesses. Universities across the country began planning symposia and workshops on trauma-informed legal procedures. Law schools added modules to their curriculum about working with child witnesses. Judges who had previously been skeptical of accommodation measures began researching the efficacy of therapy animals in courtroom settings. The American Judges Association issued a statement supporting expanded use of support animals in legal proceedings involving child trauma. Officer Max himself became an unlikely celebrity. A children's book publisher approached Officer Tom about creating a series of books featuring Max and his work helping traumatized children. A documentary filmmaker began production on a full-length film about therapy animals in the criminal justice system. Max's Instagram account, which had previously had 3,000 followers, suddenly gained 2 million new followers. People sent fan mail addressed to Officer Max at the Des Moines Police Department. But the story also attracted criticism and skepticism. Some legal commentators argued that therapy animals could compromise the adversarial process essential to justice. Conservative media outlets questioned whether this was an example of the legal system becoming too soft on certain litigants. Online forums filled with debates about whether using a therapy dog during testimony constituted unfair bias toward the child witness. James's legal team released a statement asserting that the use of the therapy animal had prejudiced the proceedings and that they were preparing an appeal. They argued that the dog's presence had created an emotional atmosphere that was designed to make the judge sympathetic to the plaintiff's position. However, this argument fell largely on deaf ears in the court of public opinion, where most people viewed the dog as a neutral, supportive presence rather than an advocacy tool. Sarah decided, after much deliberation, to do a single interview, not with a national news outlet, but with a documentary filmmaker who was producing content about trauma-informed justice. She agreed to speak, but only on the condition that Emma would never be filmed or identified. The interview would focus on her perspective as a mother navigating the court system, not on sensationalizing Emma's experience. In the weeks following the testimony, Sarah noticed changes in her community. A local elementary school invited her to speak to teachers about recognizing signs of domestic violence in children. The community college asked her to participate in a panel discussion about family trauma. These requests came from a place of genuine desire to learn and respond, not from voyeuristic curiosity. Emma, remarkably, seemed less affected by the media frenzy than Sarah might have expected. Children that young didn't understand internet culture or news cycles. To Emma, the most important reality was that she was safe with her mother, that Officer Max was the kindest dog she'd ever met, and that Daddy wasn't coming home anymore. The trial would determine custodial arrangements, but Emma's basic need for safety had already been restored. At night, Sarah would sometimes watch Emma sleep, marveling at the resilience of children while simultaneously grieving what her daughter had been forced to endure. She thought about all the other children whose stories remained silent, whose pain was dismissed or minimized, whose testimonies were disbelieved. Emma's story had inadvertently become a vehicle for those hidden narratives. 3 weeks after the courtroom testimony, the news broke. Judge Marion Whitmore's decision had been finalized. Full custody was awarded to Sarah, with supervised visitation for James, pending completion of domestic violence counseling. But more significantly, in her written opinion, the judge made an unprecedented statement about the use of therapy animals in child testimony. Judge Whitmore wrote, "The presence of Officer Max did not prejudice these proceedings. Rather, it allowed a traumatized child to access her own voice and articulate her lived experience. The authenticity of her testimony, particularly her unscripted, emotionally honest statements, was not diminished by the dog's presence. It was enabled by it. I recommend that the Iowa judicial system immediately implement policies supporting the use of trained therapy animals in proceedings involving child witnesses to trauma. Justice is not served by forcing children to suffer in silence for the sake of procedural formality." The decision was immediately hailed by advocates and condemned by legal traditionalists. But the die had been cast. Emma's story, her moment of vulnerability, her question to a dog, these things had moved beyond one family's tragedy into the realm of systemic change. The viral sensation was no longer just an emotional story. It was becoming a mandate for transformation. Judge Marion Whitmore's chambers were quiet on the morning she prepared her written decision. The judge sat at her mahogany desk, surrounded by case files, legal precedents, and her personal notes from the trial. Her law clerk, Jessica, the same woman who had posted about Emma's testimony on social media, stood nearby, waiting for instructions. But Jessica already knew what the decision would be. She had heard the judge's voice during the deliberation process, had witnessed the unwavering conviction that had guided every conclusion. At 10:47 a.m. on October 3, 2023, exactly 3 weeks after Emma's testimony, Judge Whitmore's decision was filed with the court. Within minutes, copies were distributed to both attorneys. Patricia called Sarah immediately with the news: full custody, supervised visitation, and a written opinion that would become precedent-setting. But what made this decision extraordinary wasn't merely the outcome. It was the 47-page written opinion that accompanied it. Judge Whitmore had used her decision not just to resolve the individual case, but to make a statement about how the entire judicial system should approach child testimony. The presence of Officer Max, the judge wrote, was not an accommodation that prejudiced the proceedings. Rather, it was a recognition that trauma-informed practice is not antithetical to justice. It is essential to justice. When we force traumatized children to perform their pain according to adversarial legal rules, we are not serving justice. We are reproducing the very trauma that motivated the litigation in the first place. The judge continued, "This child's unscripted words to Officer Max, 'Why do daddies do bad things? Why do people hurt people they love?' were not legally admissible testimony in the formal sense. Yet they contain more truth than hours of carefully prepared examination and cross-examination. They revealed the authentic emotional experience of a child who had witnessed violence. That authenticity, that vulnerability, that genuine distress was evidence of the reality of her experience." Judge Whitmore then went further, making recommendations that extended beyond the individual case. "I recommend to the Iowa Judicial Conference that the use of trained therapy animals in proceedings involving child witnesses to domestic violence, sexual abuse, and other forms of trauma should become standard practice, not an exception. This is not about taking sides. This is about ensuring that vulnerable witnesses can access their own voice. It is about administering justice in a way that does not cause additional harm to the already harmed." The decision was released to the media within hours. Legal analysts dissected it, domestic violence advocates celebrated it, and traditionalist legal commentators debated its implications. But the most immediate impact was on the legislative landscape. Iowa's state legislature was already in session when the decision became public. Within 2 weeks, Senator Patricia Morrison, a Democrat from Des Moines, had introduced the Emma's Law bill, officially titled the Child Witness Protection and Accommodation Act. The bill proposed comprehensive reforms to how Iowa courts handled child testimony in cases involving trauma, including mandatory availability of therapy animals, trained victim advocates for child witnesses, closed-circuit testimony options, and trauma-informed examination protocols. The bill moved through committee with unusual bipartisan support. Even conservative legislators recognized the wisdom in accommodating vulnerable witnesses while maintaining legal rigor. Senator James Chen, a Republican from Cedar Rapids, testified in favor of the bill. This isn't about being soft on crime or lenient in custody disputes. It's about recognizing that traumatized children cannot access their truth when they're terrified. We have an obligation to create conditions where evidence can be presented accurately and completely. Emma's law does that. The bill passed the Iowa legislature in November 2023, and Governor Kim Reynolds signed it into law in December. It was one of the fastest pieces of legislation to move through the Iowa system in recent memory, a testament to how profoundly Emma's story had resonated. But Iowa was just the beginning. Within 6 months, 12 additional states had introduced similar legislation. California, New York, Texas, Florida, and other states began implementing therapy animal programs in their courtrooms. The National Conference of State Legislatures issued a report on child-centered justice reforms that cited Emma's case as the catalyst for a national movement toward trauma-informed legal procedures. Officer Max became the face of this movement. The Des Moines Police Department's Victim Support Unit received funding increases and expanded to train additional therapy dogs. Officer Tom Bradley was invited to speak at judicial conferences across the country. He began traveling to other police departments, teaching other handlers how to prepare dogs for courtroom work. A nonprofit organization called Max's Voice, named after the Golden Retriever, was established to fundraise for therapy animal programs in underfunded judicial systems. The children's book series based on Officer Max and his work was published to critical acclaim. Officer Max Helps Emma Tell Her Story became a resource used in schools to help children understand that their voices matter, that there are adults who will listen, and that it's okay to ask for help. The book sold over 200,000 copies in its first year, with proceeds going to domestic violence organizations. Sarah and Emma watched from a distance as Emma's story transformed into something much larger than their personal tragedy. Emma didn't fully comprehend the national attention, but she understood that Officer Max was special and that her words had somehow mattered. When Patricia brought Emma to a domestic violence awareness event in the spring of 2024, the 3-year-old, now 4, was introduced to a room full of advocates, judges, and legal professionals who stood and applauded, not Emma herself, but what she represented. She looked confused but smiled, and Officer Max, who was present for the event, licked her face affectionately. Judge Whitmore received the Jurist of the Year award from the American Bar Association's Family Law section. In her acceptance speech, she spoke about Emma without identifying her. Justice is not served by dispassion. Justice is served by ensuring that truth can be heard, by creating conditions where the vulnerable can speak, by recognizing that compassion and legal rigor are not opposites but partners in the pursuit of truth. The judge's decision also sparked important conversations about implicit bias in the legal system. Legal scholars began examining how privilege, class, and other factors influenced whose testimony was believed and whose was dismissed. Emma's case became a starting point for broader conversations about systemic inequality in the justice system. But perhaps the most significant impact was at the grassroots level. Victim advocates across the country reported increased willingness from traumatized witnesses, not just children, to come forward and testify. The narrative that Emma's story had created, that vulnerability could be met with compassion without compromising justice, seemed to give voice to countless silenced individuals. In the autumn of 2024, the International Association of Canine Partners created the Emma Richardson Award for Excellence in Victim Support Animal Work. Officer Max was the first recipient. At the awards ceremony, Officer Tom Bradley stood on stage with the Golden Retriever, tears streaming down his face as he spoke about the profound responsibility of helping traumatized individuals access their voices. The broader legal community began to shift. Law schools added courses on trauma-informed practice. Bar associations updated ethical guidelines to encourage attorneys to consider the emotional well-being of vulnerable witnesses. Mental health professionals were increasingly integrated into legal proceedings. The courtroom was slowly being transformed from a purely adversarial arena into a space where justice and compassion could coexist. Emma's case file became a teaching tool in law schools and judicial training programs. Professors used it to illustrate multiple principles: the importance of trauma-informed practice, the limitations of adversarial approaches with vulnerable witnesses, the intersection of compassion and justice, and the power of institutional change catalyzed by individual cases. What had begun as a desperate mother's attempt to protect her daughter had become a movement. Judge Whitmore's decision, with its unprecedented recognition that trauma-informed practice should be central to justice rather than peripheral to it, had cracked open the possibility for systemic transformation. Emma's question to Officer Max, "Why do daddies do bad things?" had somehow become a question the entire legal system felt compelled to answer by changing itself. By the end of 2024, 43 states had implemented or were implementing child witness accommodation programs inspired by Emma's case. The American judicial system was slowly, incrementally, beginning to center the needs and humanity of its most vulnerable participants. 1 year after her testimony, Emma Richardson sat on the front steps of Riverside Elementary School, her new backpack decorated with stickers of princesses and dinosaurs resting beside her. She was 5 years old now, and today was her first day of kindergarten. Sarah stood nearby, camera in hand, trying to capture the moment without letting her emotions overwhelm her. This photograph, Emma smiling bravely at the entrance of her new school, represented everything Sarah had fought for in that courtroom. Her daughter was safe. Her daughter was thriving. Her daughter had a future unburdened by the immediate trauma of domestic violence. "Ready, pumpkin?" Sarah asked, extending her hand. Emma nodded solemnly, then suddenly broke into a grin. "Will there be a dog at school?" she asked hopefully. "No dogs at school, sweetie," Sarah laughed. "But maybe we can visit Officer Max soon." The mention of Officer Max still made Emma's face light up with pure joy. The bond between the child and the therapy dog had become legendary in their community. Every month, Sarah took Emma to visit Officer Tom and Officer Max at the police department. These visits had become the highlight of Emma's month, a ritual of reconnection with the being who had made her feel safe when the world was terrifying. Officer Tom had begun training Emma in simple dog handling techniques, allowing her to understand that relationships with animals could be built on trust and communication. It was therapeutic work, though no one needed to use that clinical term. To Emma, it was simply spending time with her best friend. As Sarah watched her daughter skip into the school building, she reflected on the past year. The media attention had eventually died down, though Emma's story continued to circulate in advocacy circles and educational institutions. The initial surge of celebrity had faded, replaced by something more substantive: systemic change. Sarah had done a few carefully selected interviews, speaking about her journey through the legal system and her advocacy for trauma-informed approaches. She had become a consultant for the nonprofit Max's Voice, helping develop training materials for judges and attorneys about working with traumatized child witnesses. It was meaningful work that allowed her to transform her pain into purpose. The custody arrangement was working smoothly. Emma spent supervised time with her father twice a month, and those visits had gradually become less fraught as James completed his mandated domestic violence counseling. He had genuinely confronted his own trauma and behavioral patterns, working with a therapist to understand the roots of his rage. He would never be the father Emma deserved. Too much had happened for that. But he was becoming a father who recognized his daughter's humanity and her right to safety. Meanwhile, Emma's kindergarten class was diverse, joyful, and structured around play-based learning. Her teacher, Ms. Patricia Liu, had specifically requested Emma because she had read about the case and understood the importance of creating a nurturing environment for a child who had experienced early trauma. Ms. Liu's classroom was safe, predictable, and full of compassionate adults who recognized the signs of trauma and knew how to respond with gentleness. Emma had started therapy with Dr. Sarah Chen, a child psychologist specializing in trauma work with young children. The therapy wasn't intensive or interventionist. Rather, it was primarily play-based, allowing Emma to process her experiences through storytelling, art, and imaginative play. Dr. Chen had worked with Officer Max's case and understood that sometimes the most powerful healing came not from clinical interventions, but from the presence of beings who understood pain without judgment. Des Moines, Judge Marion Whitmore sat in her chambers reviewing applications for the newly created position of Trauma-Informed Justice Coordinator for the Iowa judicial system. The position had been created as a direct result of her recommendations in Emma's case. The coordinator would work with judges and attorneys to implement best practices for working with traumatized witnesses, would oversee the therapy animal program, and would ensure that courtrooms were spaces of both rigor and compassion. The judge had received hundreds of letters over the past year, from people sharing their own stories of trauma and legal proceedings, from judges in other states seeking guidance on implementing similar reforms, from law students writing their theses on the implications of Emma's case. One letter particularly moved Judge Whitmore. It was from a woman in her 60s who wrote, "I testified in a custody case when I was 7 years old. The judge didn't believe me. I spent my entire life carrying the shame and doubt, believing that I had failed to protect my mother. Reading about Emma's case, about how she was finally heard and believed, I finally understood that I wasn't lying then. I was just a scared child whose truth didn't fit the legal system's requirements. Thank you for changing that system." Judge Whitmore had responded personally to that letter, and it had prompted her to begin archiving stories from people whose testimony had been disbelieved or dismissed. She was creating an informal collection of these narratives, which she planned to eventually publish as a book titled The Voices We Failed to Hear: Stories of Dismissed Testimony. It would be her final major contribution to the legal system before her eventual retirement. Officer Max had become something of an elder statesman in the therapy animal community. At 6 years old, in dog years, entering his senior phase, he had worked with over 800 child witnesses. His impact had been documented and studied. Researchers at the University of Iowa had conducted a comparative analysis showing that child witnesses supported by therapy animals had significantly higher rates of coherent, detailed testimony and significantly lower rates of recantation than those testifying without animal support. But for Officer Tom Bradley, the statistics were secondary to the individual moments. He thought about each child he had worked with, the shy boy from rural Iowa who had finally spoken about his sexual abuse, the girl with selective mutism who had whispered her story to Max when she couldn't speak to anyone else, the teenager who had articulated her experience of trafficking while her hands gripped Max's fur for stability. Each child had experienced a moment of being heard, being believed, being supported. That was what mattered. Officer Tom had begun writing a book about his experiences training and working with Max. It would be part memoir, part training manual, part meditation on the intersection of compassion and justice. Publishers were interested, and he hoped to publish it within the year. By the autumn of 2024, Emma's story had achieved a different kind of permanence. It was no longer trending on social media, but it had become woven into the fabric of legal and social discourse about child protection. Universities taught Emma's case in their law and social work programs. Advocacy organizations referenced it in their training materials. Policy makers cited it when discussing victim support systems. The viral moment had transformed into lasting institutional change. A documentary film about Emma's case premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in January 2025, where it received a standing ovation. The film, titled The Voice of a Child, focused not just on Emma's story, but on the broader movement toward trauma-informed justice that had followed. It included interviews with Judge Whitmore, Officer Tom, advocates, and other children who had benefited from therapy animal support in legal proceedings. The film went on to win several awards and reach a wide audience. Emma, now 5 years old and adjusting beautifully to kindergarten, remained unaware of most of this. She knew that she had helped people by being brave in the big building. She knew that Officer Max was special. She knew that her mommy was proud of her. And she knew, in the way that children do, that she was safe. Sarah sometimes wondered what Emma would understand about her own story as she grew older. Would she remember the testimony? Would she understand its significance? Or would it simply be a fragment of early childhood, hazy and dreamlike, remembered more through family stories and photographs than through direct memory? What mattered, Sarah had come to understand, wasn't whether Emma remembered the specific details. What mattered was that Emma had survived the experience. What mattered was that she was thriving. What mattered was that her voice had been heard and believed, and that her truth had contributed to transforming a system that had too often silenced vulnerable people. In the spring of 2025, Emma received an invitation to visit Officer Max at a special event, the dedication of the newly expanded Victim Support Unit at the Des Moines Police Department. The facility now housed 4 therapy dogs, Officer Max, plus 3 younger dogs being trained for similar work, training facilities, and a comfortable space where child witnesses could meet with their support animals before court proceedings. A bronze plaque was unveiled that day, engraved with words that made Sarah cry. This facility is dedicated to Officer Max and the children he has supported, in memory of Emma's courage and in honor of all voices that deserve to be heard. Emma was too young to fully understand the significance, but she smiled at Officer Max and hugged him fiercely. The dog, now graying around the muzzle, returned her embrace with the same gentle presence he had offered in that courtroom 3 years earlier. As Sarah watched her daughter and the dog together, she thought about how one moment of vulnerability, a 3-year-old asking a dog why people hurt people they love, had rippled outward to transform systems, inspire movements, and ultimately validate countless silenced voices. Emma's question, asked in desperation and fear, had somehow become a question the world had felt compelled to answer. And in answering, society had begun to change, to center compassion alongside justice, to create space for human vulnerability within legal proceedings, to recognize that true justice could only emerge when the vulnerable were truly heard. Emma Richardson had been a traumatized child testifying in a custody dispute, but her unscripted truth, delivered to a therapy dog, had made her something more, a catalyst for transformation, a voice that had not merely been heard but had fundamentally altered how systems listened to children. And that, Sarah understood, was the real triumph. The end.